If you've ever walked alone in the woods and felt the air turn cold, as if the trees themselves were watching, you know the kind of fear that lingers in the bones of old towns. Tonight, I'll tell you a story that's haunted Danvers, Massachusetts for nearly 3 centuries. A story of 3 women, a cursed oak, and a secret the earth itself refuses to swallow. If you enjoy eerie true stories like this one, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a tale from the shadows. The year was 1737, and the wounds of Salem Village, now called Danvers, were still raw. The witch trials had ended decades before, but the land had not forgotten. The people certainly hadn't. They walked with their heads down, eyes averted, as if afraid to meet the gaze of their own neighbors. The woods pressed close around the village, thick with secrets and the memory of screams. It was in the early hours of a storm-lashed morning that the bodies were found. 3 women, unknown to any living soul in Danvers, hanged from the ancient oak that stood just beyond the last crumbling stone wall of the village. Their hands were bound with braided horsehair, so tight the skin beneath was bruised and broken. Their bodies formed a perfect triangle, heads pointed toward the gnarled roots, as if the tree itself had summoned them home. No one claimed to know who they were. No one stepped forward to say they'd seen them arrive or heard their voices in the market or watched them pass by candlelight. The town records, kept in a trembling hand by the minister's wife, listed them only as the 3 returned. No trials were held, no accusations were made, no burials were given. The bodies were left to rot, and the tree was left to stand. But the story does not begin with the hangings. It begins with the land and the people who tried to tame it. Before the Puritans, before the first stones were laid for the meeting house, the woods were said to be haunted. The Algonquin spoke of spirits that lived in the trees and of a great oak that bled when wounded. The settlers, desperate to carve out a home, ignored the warnings. They cut, they burned, they built. But the oak remained, untouched, as if protected by something older and darker than any law. By 1737, the village had grown used to its presence. Children dared each other to touch its bark, and old women whispered prayers when they passed. It was said that the tree wept blood during storms, and that the ground beneath it was always soft, no matter how dry the summer. Some claimed to see faces in the knots of its trunk or to hear voices in the wind that rustled its leaves. But no one, not even the bravest, would go near it after dark. The night before the bodies were found, a storm rolled in from the sea. The wind howled through the village, rattling shutters and tearing branches from the trees. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the oak in brief, blinding flashes. Those who lay awake claimed to hear screams carried on the wind, high and thin like the wailing of lost souls. But in the morning, when the storm had passed, the only sound was the cawing of crows. It was a boy who found them. Samuel Proctor, 12 years old, sent to gather kindling from the edge of the woods. He saw the bodies first as shapes, swaying gently in the breeze, their dresses torn and stained with mud. He ran back to the village, white-faced and shaking, and soon a crowd had gathered at the tree. Men with axes, women clutching rosaries, children peering from behind their mothers' skirts. The minister, Reverend Josiah Hale, was called. He stood beneath the oak, his face pale, his hands trembling. He ordered the bodies cut down, but no one would touch them. The memory of the trials was too fresh, the fear too deep. In the end, the bodies were left where they hung, and the crowd drifted away, whispering prayers and curses. That night, the dreams began. The villagers tossed and turned, plagued by visions of the 3 women, their faces hidden by tangled hair, their mouths sewn shut with horsehair thread. Some dreamed of the oak, its branches reaching down to drag them into the earth. Others dreamed of fire, of screams, of a darkness that pressed in from all sides. In the days that followed, the village changed. Milk soured in the pail. Bread refused to rise. Chickens laid eggs with blood-red yolks. The minister's wife, who kept the records, began to lose her mind. She spoke of voices in the walls, of shadows that moved on their own. She wrote the same words over and over in her ledger. The three returned. The three returned. No one dared go near the oak. The grass around it withered and died, and the air grew thick with the stench of rot. The crows gathered in the branches, their eyes bright and watchful. At night, the villagers heard footsteps on the road, soft and shuffling, as if someone, or something, was walking the edge of the woods. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the women were witches come back to claim vengeance for the sins of the past. Others whispered that they were not women at all, but spirits or demons, or something older and hungrier than either. A few, the oldest and most fearful, claimed to recognize the faces in their dreams, faces they had seen before, in the flickering light of the trial fires, or in the shadows of the meeting house. But no one spoke aloud what they all feared, that the land itself was cursed and that the sins of Salem had never truly been buried. And so the oak stood, and the bodies hung, and the village waited, breath held, for whatever would come next. The waiting became a kind of sickness. Days passed, then weeks, and the bodies on the tree began to change. Their skin shriveled and blackened, but the crows would not touch them. Not a single beak tore at their flesh. Not a single feather brushed their tangled hair. The villagers watched from a distance, unable to look away, as if the women's presence was a wound that refused to close. Reverend Hale tried to keep order. He preached of patience, of faith, of the Lord's mysterious ways. But his words rang hollow in the cold, damp air. The congregation shrank with each passing Sunday. Some families packed their belongings and left for Boston or Marblehead, their wagons creaking down the muddy road before dawn. Others locked their doors and shuttered their windows, refusing to speak of what hung at the edge of the woods. The children, once bold enough to dare each other near the oak, now avoided the path entirely. They whispered stories in the dark, stories of the three returned, of how they would come for anyone who strayed too close. They said the women's eyes glowed red at night, and that if you listened closely, you could hear them whispering secrets to the roots of the tree. One night, a group of boys, Samuel Proctor among them, gathered in the Proctor barn, huddled around a single flickering candle. The wind rattled the boards, and the smell of hay and old leather filled the air. Samuel's voice was barely more than a whisper as he told the others what he'd seen that morning. A trail of muddy footprints leading from the edge of the woods to the back door of the meeting house. The prints were small, like a woman's, and they vanished as suddenly as they appeared. The boys argued over what it meant. Some said it was just the rain or a trick of the light. Others insisted it was a sign. The three returned were not content to hang in silence. They wanted something. They were waiting for someone to listen. That same night, Abigail Putnam, the minister's wife, awoke to the sound of scratching at her window. She sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, as if someone was dragging their fingernails across the glass. She rose, clutching her shawl around her shoulders, and crept to the window. Outside, the moon hung low and red, casting long shadows across the yard. She saw nothing but darkness, yet the scratching continued, now joined by a faint, breathless whisper. Abigail pressed her ear to the glass, straining to hear. The words were muffled, but she caught a single phrase repeated over and over. "Let us in. Let us in." She stumbled back, tripping over the hem of her nightgown, and fell to the floor. The whispering stopped. The room was silent, save for the frantic beating of her heart. She crawled back into bed and pulled the covers over her head, praying for morning. When dawn came, Abigail found 3 long scratches on the outside of her window, deep and fresh, as if carved by fingernails. She told no one, not even her husband. But that day she began to write in her ledger with a new urgency, her script growing more frantic with each entry. She wrote of dreams and voices, of shadows that moved where they shouldn't, of a coldness that seeped into her bones and would not leave. The villagers began to notice other changes. The well water turned brackish and foul, and no amount of boiling could make it clean. The cows gave birth to stillborn calves, their bodies twisted and wrong. The air itself seemed heavier, pressing down on the village like a shroud. At night, the wind carried strange sounds: laughter, weeping, the creak of rope. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees, a stranger arrived in Danvers. He was a tall man, dressed in a long black coat, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. He carried no luggage, only a walking stick carved with strange symbols. He introduced himself as Elias Ward, a scholar from Boston, come to study the unusual phenomena reported in the area. The villagers eyed him with suspicion, but Reverend Hale welcomed him into his home. Over supper, Elias asked careful questions about the three returned, about the oak, about the dreams that plagued the village. He listened intently, his dark eyes never leaving the faces of those who spoke. That night, Elias walked alone to the edge of the woods. He stood beneath the oak, staring up at the bodies, his breath clouding in the cold air. He knelt and pressed his palm to the earth, whispering words in a language no one in Danvers would have recognized. The crows watched in silence, their heads cocked, as if waiting for something to happen. The next morning, Elias returned to the village, his coat damp with dew. He asked to see Abigail Putnam's ledger, and she handed it over with trembling hands. He read her entries in silence, his brow furrowing as he turned the pages. When he finished, he closed the book and looked up at Abigail. "These women," he said quietly, "they are not strangers to this place. Not truly. The land remembers them, even if you do not." Abigail's hands shook as she poured him tea. "What do you mean?" Elias hesitated, choosing his words with care. "There are stories, old stories, of women who vanished from Salem Village during the trials. Women who were never found, never named. Some say they fled into the woods seeking refuge among the trees. Others say they made a bargain, trading their names for safety. But bargains have a way of coming due." Abigail stared at him, her eyes wide with fear. "What do you think they want?" Elias looked out the window toward the oak. "I think they want to be remembered, and I think they want justice." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Outside, the wind began to rise, and the crows took flight, circling the oak in a widening spiral. The village held its breath, waiting for the next shadow to fall. The crows' spiral over the oak cast flickering shadows across the fields, and the villagers watched from behind curtains and shutters, their faces pale and drawn. Elias Ward's words echoed in Abigail's mind as she sat by the window, her hands wrapped tightly around her teacup. She could not shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the stranger's arrival had stirred the air, as if the very ground beneath Danvers was listening. That night, the dreams grew worse. Abigail saw the three women standing at the foot of her bed, their faces hidden by veils of black hair, their hands bound with horsehair. They did not speak, but their presence pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She woke gasping, her nightgown soaked with sweat, the taste of earth and blood thick in her mouth. She was not alone. Across the village, others woke screaming, clutching at their throats or weeping into their pillows. The children cried for their mothers, and the men sat up in bed staring into the darkness, afraid to close their eyes again. In the morning, the village was silent, as if everyone was waiting for someone else to speak first. Elias spent his days walking the edge of the woods, taking careful notes in a battered leather journal. He spoke with the oldest villagers, coaxing stories from their reluctant lips. He learned of the old superstitions, the salt thrown over shoulders, the iron nails hammered into door frames, the prayers whispered to the trees. He listened to tales of the oak, of how it had stood since before the first settlers arrived, and how it was said to bleed when wounded. One afternoon, Elias visited the home of Mary Bradbury, the oldest woman in Danvers. She lived alone in a sagging cottage at the edge of the fields, her hair white as snow, her eyes sharp and clear. She greeted Elias with suspicion, but when he mentioned the three returned, her expression changed. She invited him in, and they sat by the fire as the wind rattled the windows. Mary spoke in a low voice, her words careful and measured. "I was a girl during the trials," she said. "I remember the fear, the accusations. My mother told me to keep my head down, to say nothing, to trust no one. There were women who vanished, yes. Not all were hanged. Some simply disappeared." Elias leaned forward. "Do you remember their names?" Mary shook her head. "No one spoke their names. It was safer that way. But I remember their faces. One had a birthmark on her cheek, shaped like a crescent moon. Another had hair the color of autumn leaves. The third, she was always quiet, always watching. They were kind to me once. Gave me bread when my mother was sick." She fell silent, staring into the fire. Elias waited, sensing there was more. Mary's voice dropped to a whisper. "After they vanished, strange things began to happen. Livestock died, milk soured, the woods grew darker. My mother said the land was angry, that the wrongs done here would not be forgotten. She told me to stay away from the oak, to never speak of what I'd seen." Elias thanked her and left, his mind racing. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but the picture they formed was darker than he'd imagined. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elias returned to the oak. The air was thick with the scent of rain, and the crows had gathered again, their cries echoing through the trees. He knelt at the base of the tree, pressing his hand to the earth. The ground was soft, almost spongy, and a chill ran up his arm. He closed his eyes and whispered the names he'd learned from Mary's stories, though he did not know if they were true. He asked for forgiveness, for understanding, for the truth to be revealed. The wind rose, swirling around him, carrying with it the faintest hint of voices. Soft, pleading, desperate. Suddenly, the ground beneath his hand grew colder, and he felt something move beneath the soil. He jerked his hand back, heart pounding, but nothing emerged. The crows fell silent, and for a moment, the only sound was the rustle of leaves. Elias stood and backed away, his breath coming in short gasps. He felt as if he'd trespassed on sacred ground, as if the tree itself was watching him. He hurried back to the village, the sense of being followed prickling at his neck. That night, the storm returned. Rain lashed the windows and thunder shook the earth. The villagers huddled in their homes, praying for morning. But the storm brought more than rain. In the darkness, shapes moved through the streets. 3 figures, their dresses trailing in the mud, their hair streaming behind them like banners of shadow. Samuel Proctor, unable to sleep, watched from his attic window. He saw the figures glide past his house, their feet leaving no mark in the mud. He pressed his face to the glass, heart hammering as they paused beneath the old meeting house. One of them turned, and for a moment he saw her face, pale, hollow-eyed, lips sewn shut with black thread. He stumbled back, tripping over a pile of blankets, and when he looked again, the figures were gone. But the next morning, the villagers found 3 sets of muddy footprints leading from the meeting house to the oak. The footprints stopped at the base of the tree, and in the soft earth, someone had scratched a single word: remember. Panic spread through Danvers. Some demanded the bodies be cut down and burned. Others insisted they be buried in consecrated ground. Reverend Hale called for a day of fasting and prayer, but few attended. Fear had taken root, and it grew with every passing hour. Elias met with Abigail and Reverend Hale in the parlor of the parsonage. He laid out his findings, his voice steady but urgent. These women are not at rest. The land remembers what was done here, even if we do not. If we do not face the truth, the hauntings will only grow worse. Reverend Hale's face was drawn, his eyes rimmed with red. What truth, Mr. Ward? What must we do? Elias looked from the minister to his wife, then out the window toward the oak. We must remember their names. We must tell their story. Only then will the land be satisfied. Outside, the storm raged on, and the crows circled the tree, waiting for the dawn. Dawn broke gray and sullen over Danvers, the storm's fury spent, but its memory lingering in the sodden earth and battered rooftops. The crows had scattered, but the oak stood unchanged, its branches heavy with the weight of the 3 women. The word remember was still visible in the mud, the letters already softening in the morning drizzle. Inside the parsonage, Elias, Abigail, and Reverend Hale sat in uneasy silence. The minister's hands trembled as he poured weak tea, his eyes darting to the window as if expecting the women to appear at any moment. Abigail clutched her ledger, her knuckles white, her mind racing with fragments of dreams and half-remembered stories. Elias broke the silence. "We must gather the village, all who remain. We must speak the truth aloud, together. Secrets fester in darkness, but perhaps if we bring them into the light, the curse will loosen its hold." Reverend Hale hesitated, his voice thin. "There will be resistance. Many are afraid. Some would rather forget." Elias's gaze was steady. "Forgetting is what brought this upon you. The land does not forget, nor do the dead." Abigail nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I will help. I will read from the ledger, the names, the stories, even if they are only fragments." The plan was set. That afternoon the church bell rang out, its cracked voice echoing through the village. One by one, the people of Danvers emerged from their homes, drawn by fear, curiosity, or the simple need to be among others. They gathered in the meeting house, the air thick with the scent of damp wool and nervous sweat. Elias stood at the front, flanked by Abigail and Reverend Hale. He spoke first, his voice calm but commanding. "You all know what has happened. You have seen the signs. The three returned are not strangers. They are the memory of what was done here, the price of silence and forgetting. We must remember them, and we must speak their truth." He nodded to Abigail, who opened her ledger with shaking hands. She read aloud the names of the vanished women, the details as best as she could recall from her mother's stories and the faded records. Margaret Wilkins with the crescent birthmark, Ruth Abbott, hair like autumn leaves, Silence Carter, the watcher. The names hung in the air, heavy and unfamiliar, yet somehow right. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some faces showed recognition, others only fear. Abigail continued, her voice growing stronger. "They were not witches. They were our neighbors, our kin. They vanished during the trials, not by rope or fire, but by fear. Their names were struck from the records, their memories buried. But the land remembers. The oak remembers." A silence fell, broken only by the sound of rain against the windows. Then, from the back of the room, an old man stood. His name was Thomas Bishop, and his voice was rough with age. "My grandmother spoke of Margaret Wilkins, said she was kind, that she helped birth my father when the midwife was sick. She vanished one night and no one spoke of her again. Others began to speak slowly at first, then with growing urgency. Stories tumbled out, of Ruth Abbott's laughter, of Silence Carter's gentle hands, of kindnesses given and debts unpaid. The meeting house filled with the sound of memory, of grief and regret and longing. Reverend Hale stepped forward, his voice trembling but clear. "We have sinned, not by what we did, but by what we allowed, by our silence. We must ask forgiveness, not just from God, but from those we wronged." Elias nodded, his eyes shining with something like hope. "Tonight we will gather at the oak. We will speak their names. We will lay them to rest, as they should have been long ago." The villagers dispersed, some weeping openly, others silent and grim. The news spread quickly, and by dusk a crowd had gathered at the edge of the woods. Lanterns flickered in the gloom, casting long shadows across the wet grass. The oak loomed above them, its branches creaking in the wind. Elias led the way, carrying a bundle of wildflowers and a length of white linen. Abigail followed, her ledger pressed to her chest. Reverend Hale brought a Bible, his hands steady now, his face set with determination. They stood beneath the tree, the villagers arrayed behind them. The bodies still hung, but something had changed. Their faces were less twisted, their hair less wild. The air was heavy with anticipation, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Elias spoke first, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "Margaret Wilkins, Ruth Abbott, Silence Carter. We remember you. We speak your names. We ask your forgiveness. Abigail read from her ledger, recounting the stories she had gathered. The villagers added their own memories, their voices weaving together in a tapestry of sorrow and remembrance. Reverend Hale stepped forward, Bible in hand. He recited the Lord's Prayer, his voice steady and sure. When he finished, he looked up at the bodies, his eyes shining with tears. May you find peace. May you find rest. Elias and Abigail laid the wildflowers at the base of the tree, and the linen was draped over the roots. The villagers stood in silence, the only sound the whisper of wind through the leaves. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the bodies began to sway, as if caught by an unseen breeze. The crows returned, circling above, their cries softer now, almost mournful. A sense of release filled the air, a loosening of the tension that had gripped the village for so long. The oak seemed to stand taller, its branches reaching skyward, its roots sinking deeper into the earth. But as the villagers turned to leave, a chill swept through the crowd. Elias felt it first, a prickling at the back of his neck, a sense of being watched. He turned, and for a brief moment, he saw 3 figures standing at the edge of the woods, their faces calm, their eyes bright with something that was not quite forgiveness. The moment passed, and the figures were gone. The villagers drifted back to their homes, uncertain but hopeful, their hearts lighter than they had been in weeks. But the oak remained, and the land was still restless. The story was not yet finished. That night, the village of Danvers slept more soundly than it had in weeks. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight of dread momentarily lifted. Yet, beneath the surface, unease lingered, a subtle, persistent ache, like a bruise that would not fade. The oak stood silent, its branches unmoving in the stillness, but the ground beneath it seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, as if the earth itself was waiting. Elias Ward did not sleep. He sat at the desk in his small rented room, the candle burning low, his journal open before him. He wrote down every detail he could recall, the names spoken, the stories shared, the strange sense of release that had swept through the crowd. Yet as he wrote, a nagging doubt crept in. Had it truly been enough? Had the women found peace, or had they simply been acknowledged? He thought of the 3 figures he'd seen at the edge of the woods, their eyes bright, their faces calm, but not quite forgiving. He remembered the chill that had swept through him, the sense of unfinished business. He closed his journal and stared out the window, watching the moonlight glint off the wet grass. Somewhere in the distance, a single crow called, its voice sharp and lonely. In the days that followed, life in Danvers began to return to a semblance of normalcy. The milk no longer soured, the bread rose as it should, and the well water ran clear. The children ventured out to play again, though they still avoided the path near the oak. The villagers spoke more freely, sharing stories of the past, as if the act of remembering had loosened the grip of fear. But not all was well. Abigail Putnam grew pale and withdrawn, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. She confided in Elias that the dreams had not stopped. If anything, they had grown more vivid. She saw the 3 women not as vengeful spirits, but as mourners, grieving, searching, calling out for something lost. They want something more, Abigail whispered one morning, her hands trembling as she poured tea. They want to be found. Not just remembered, but truly found. Elias listened, his mind racing. He thought of Mary Bradbury's words, of the bargains made and the names forgotten. He wondered if the women's bodies, those that hung from the oak, were truly theirs, or if the truth was buried deeper still. That afternoon, Elias returned to the oak. The ground was soft beneath his boots, the grass still flattened where the villagers had gathered. He knelt at the base of the tree, pressing his palm to the earth as he had before. This time, he felt a faint vibration, a subtle hum that seemed to rise from the roots themselves. He closed his eyes and let his mind drift, searching for a connection, a thread to follow. Images flickered behind his eyelids. A woman running through the woods, her breath ragged. Another kneeling by a stream, washing blood from her hands. A third standing before the oak, her face streaked with tears. Elias opened his eyes, heart pounding. He realized with sudden clarity that the story was not finished. The women had not been hanged for witchcraft, nor had they been executed by the village. They had come to the oak willingly, seeking something. Sanctuary, perhaps, or absolution. But what had happened next? Who had bound their hands? Who had arranged their bodies in that perfect triangle? He rose and brushed the dirt from his knees, his mind whirling. He needed answers, and he knew where to look. That evening, Elias visited Mary Bradbury once more. The old woman greeted him with a knowing look, as if she had been expecting him. They sat by the fire, the room warm and close, the shadows deepening as the sun set. "I have more to tell you," Mary said, her voice low, "but you must promise to listen, truly listen. The truth is not always what we wish it to be." Elias nodded, his heart heavy. "I promise." Mary took a deep breath and began. After the trials, there were those who could not let go of their fear. They saw witches everywhere, in the woods, in the fields, in the faces of their neighbors. Some formed a secret pact, a covenant of silence and vigilance. They called themselves the Watchers. Elias felt a chill run down his spine. What did they do? "They hunted," Mary whispered. "Not openly, not with trials or accusations. They watched, they waited, and when they found those they deemed dangerous, they acted in secret. The three women, Margaret, Ruth, and Silence, were not hanged by the village. They were taken by the Watchers, bound and brought to the oak. It was meant to be a warning, a sacrifice to keep the darkness at bay." Elias's hands clenched in his lap. "Did you see it happen?" Mary shook her head, tears glinting in her eyes. "I heard the screams. I saw the men return, their faces pale, their hands shaking. My mother told me to say nothing, to forget, but I never forgot." The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Elias felt the weight of the truth settle over him, heavy and cold. The women had not been witches, nor had they been strangers. They had been sacrificed by their own, betrayed by fear and secrecy. He thanked Mary and left, his mind reeling. The Watchers, were they still among the villagers? Did their descendants walk the streets of Danvers, carrying the burden of their ancestors' sins? That night, Elias met with Abigail and Reverend Hale. He told them what he had learned, his voice shaking with anger and sorrow. Abigail wept, her tears falling onto the pages of her ledger. Reverend Hale sat in silence, his face ashen. "We must tell the village," Elias said. "We must name the Watchers. Only then will the curse be broken." Outside, the wind rose, and the oak shivered in the darkness. The land was listening, waiting for the truth to finally come to light. The next morning, a heavy fog blanketed Danvers, muffling sound and blurring the edges of every house and tree. The village felt suspended, caught between worlds, as if the past and present were bleeding into one another. Elias, Abigail, and Reverend Hale gathered in the parsonage before dawn, their faces drawn and pale in the candlelight. "We must be careful," Reverend Hale said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If we accuse the wrong people, we risk tearing the village apart." Elias shook his head. "We do not need to accuse. We need only to speak the truth. The Watchers are not a secret to be kept any longer. Their deeds have poisoned this land for too long." Abigail nodded, her eyes red from weeping. "We must let the village decide what to do with the truth, but we cannot keep it hidden." As the fog began to lift, the church bell rang again, its sound muffled but insistent. The villagers gathered, their faces wary, their eyes darting from one neighbor to the next. The memory of the last meeting still lingered, but this time, there was a new tension in the air. a sense that something final was about to be revealed. Elias stood before them, his journal in hand. He spoke plainly, his voice steady. "We have learned the truth of the three returned. They were not witches. They were not strangers. They were our own, sacrificed by a secret group who called themselves the Watchers. This was not justice, it was fear. And it was murder." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Some faces blanched, others hardened. An old man in the front row, his hands twisted with age, began to weep silently. Abigail stepped forward, her ledger open. "We have names, not all, but some. The Watchers were men of this village, fathers, brothers, sons. Their descendants are among us still. We do not speak these names to bring shame, but to bring truth. The land demands it. The dead demand it." She read the names, her voice trembling. John Proctor, Samuel Bishop, Thomas Wilkins, others unnamed, but known in the shadows of memory. A heavy silence fell. The villagers shifted uneasily, some looking at their feet, others at the faces of those named. The old man who had wept now covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. Reverend Hale spoke, his voice grave. "We cannot change what was done, but we can choose what we do now. We can confess, we can seek forgiveness, and we can lay these souls to rest." A woman in the back, her hair streaked with gray, stepped forward. "My grandfather was Thomas Wilkins. He never spoke of what happened, but he carried a sadness with him all his days. I am sorry. I am so sorry." Others followed, some confessing, some weeping, some simply standing in silence. The truth, once spoken, spread through the crowd like a cleansing fire. The weight of generations began to lift, replaced by a raw, aching grief. Elias felt the air shift, as if the land itself was breathing easier, but he knew it was not enough. The women's bodies still hung from the oak, their story unfinished. That night, the village gathered once more at the edge of the woods. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness, casting long shadows across the grass. The oak loomed above them, its branches heavy with the memory of what had been done. Elias led the way, his heart pounding. Abigail and Reverend Hale followed, their faces set with determination. The villagers formed a circle around the tree, their voices low and solemn. Elias spoke first. "We have named the Watchers. We have spoken the truth. Now we must lay these women to rest, as they should have been long ago." He turned to the villagers. "Will you help us?" A murmur of assent rose from the crowd. Together they approached the tree. The bodies impossibly seemed lighter now, their faces peaceful in the lantern light. The ropes were cut, and the women were lowered gently to the ground. Abigail knelt beside them, her hand shaking as she brushed hair from their faces. "We remember you," she whispered. "We are sorry." The villagers dug 3 graves at the base of the oak, their hands blistered and raw. The women were wrapped in linen, wildflowers placed on their chests. Reverend Hale read from the Bible, his voice steady and sure. As the last grave was filled, a hush fell over the crowd. The wind rose, rustling the leaves, and for a moment, the air shimmered with something like hope. But as the villagers turned to leave, Elias felt a cold hand close around his heart. He looked back at the oak and saw, for the briefest instant, 3 figures standing among the roots. Their faces were calm, their eyes bright, but their mouths were still sewn shut. He shivered, the sense of unfinished business stronger than ever. The women had been laid to rest, but their voices had not been freed. The truth had been spoken, but not all had been revealed. That night Elias dreamed of the oak. He saw its roots twisting deep into the earth, wrapping around bones and secrets. He heard the women's voices, muffled and desperate, calling out from beneath the ground. He woke before dawn, his heart racing. The curse was not broken. The land was not yet satisfied. There was something deeper, something older, that still held Danvers in its grip. Elias knew what he had to do. He would return to the oak alone and face whatever waited beneath its roots. Only then, he sensed, would the true story of the three returned be revealed. Elias waited until the first pale light of dawn crept over the fields, painting the world in shades of gray and silver. The village was silent, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. He dressed quietly, careful not to wake the household, and slipped out into the chill morning. The path to the oak was slick with dew, the grass bending beneath his boots. He carried only his journal and a small lantern, its flame flickering uncertainly in the breeze. As he walked, the woods seemed to close in around him, the trees pressing close, their branches arching overhead like the ribs of some ancient beast. The silence was complete, broken only by the distant call of a crow. When he reached the oak, he paused, heart pounding. The graves at its base were fresh, the earth still mounded and dark. The linen shrouds had been covered with wildflowers, now wilted and damp from the night's rain. Elias knelt and placed his hand on the soil, feeling the cold seep into his skin. He closed his eyes and whispered, "I am here. I am listening. Tell me what you need." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, a chill crept up his arm and he felt a faint vibration beneath his palm. A pulse, steady and insistent, like a heartbeat deep within the earth. The lantern's flame guttered, casting wild shadows across the roots. Images flooded his mind. The three women, standing in a circle beneath the oak, their hands joined, their faces solemn. He saw them whispering words he could not understand, their voices rising and falling in a strange, lilting cadence. The air shimmered around them, thick with power and sorrow. He saw men emerge from the darkness, faces twisted with fear, hands clutching ropes and knives. The women did not run. They stood their ground, eyes shining with defiance and grief. The men seized them, bound their hands with horsehair and forced them to their knees. Elias felt the agony of betrayal, the terror of helplessness. He saw the ropes thrown over the branches, the bodies lifted, the triangle formed. He felt the land itself recoil, the roots of the oak writhing in protest. Then, the vision shifted. He saw the roots burrowing deeper, wrapping around bones and broken things. He saw faces in the earth, dozens, maybe hundreds, women and men, children and elders, all lost to time and memory. Their mouths were sewn shut, their eyes wide with pleading. Elias gasped, pulling his hand away. The vision faded, but the sense of despair lingered. The three returned were not alone. The land was thick with the dead, with secrets and sorrow that stretched back long before the trials, before the village, before the first stone was laid. He staggered to his feet, breath coming in ragged gasps. The oak loomed above him, its branches trembling in the morning breeze. He realized, with a sick certainty, that the curse was not just about the three women. It was about all the forgotten dead, all the voices silenced by fear and violence. Elias opened his journal and began to write, his hand shaking. He wrote down everything he had seen, every detail of the vision, every name and face that flickered through his mind. He wrote until his fingers cramped and the lantern's flame died. As the sun rose higher, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Abigail approaching, her face pale and drawn. She knelt beside him, her eyes searching his. "I dreamed of you," she whispered. "I saw you here at the oak. I saw the roots, the faces. I heard them calling." Elias nodded, unable to speak. He handed her the journal and she read in silence, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We must tell the village," she said at last. "We must tell them all of it, not just about the Watchers, but about the land, the dead, the truth that has been buried for so long." Elias hesitated. "Will they believe us?" Abigail's voice was steady. "They must. If they do not, the curse will never end. The land will never heal." Together, they returned to the village, the weight of their task pressing down on them. They called another meeting, this time in the open air, beneath the gray sky. The villagers gathered, their faces wary, their eyes haunted. Elias spoke first, his voice clear and strong. He told them of his vision, of the roots and the faces, of the sorrow that filled the land. He spoke of the three returned, but also of all the others, the forgotten, the silenced, the lost. Abigail read from the journal, her voice trembling but resolute. She spoke of the need to remember, to honor, to speak the names of the dead. She urged the villagers to come forward, to share their own stories, to break the silence that had poisoned their home. At first there was only silence. Then, slowly, one by one, the villagers began to speak. They told stories of lost loved ones, of secrets kept, of wrongs done and never righted. The air was thick with grief and confession, but also with hope, a sense that at last the truth was being brought into the light. As the meeting ended, Elias felt a shift in the air, a loosening, a lightening. The land seemed to breathe easier, the weight of centuries lifting, if only a little. But as he looked back at the oak, he saw the three figures once more, standing among the roots. Their mouths were still sewn shut, but their eyes met his, filled with gratitude and warning. The work was not yet done. The dead were not yet free. The final secret still waited, deep beneath the roots, in the heart of the land itself. That night the village was restless. The air was thick and still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Elias sat by his window, watching the moon rise over the fields, its pale light silvering the rooftops and the distant line of trees. He could not sleep. The vision of the faces in the earth haunted him, their eyes pleading, their mouths sewn shut by centuries of silence. He thought of the three returned, of the gratitude and warning in their gaze. He wondered what final secret still lay hidden beneath the oak, what truth the land demanded before it would release its dead. He felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, heavier than ever. A soft knock at his door startled him from his thoughts. He opened it to find Samuel Proctor, the boy who had first found the bodies. Samuel's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Mr. Ward," he whispered. "I saw them again. The women. They came to my window. They didn't speak, but they pointed to the woods. I think they want you to come." Elias's heart pounded. He grabbed his lantern and followed Samuel through the sleeping village, their footsteps muffled by the damp earth. The boy led him to the edge of the woods, where the path to the oak began. There in the moonlight, three faint shapes waited, tall, silent, their hair streaming like banners in the wind. Elias stepped forward, his breath clouding in the cold air. The figures turned and glided into the trees, their forms flickering like candle flames. He followed, Samuel close behind, the lantern's light bobbing in the darkness. The woods were different at night, deeper, older, filled with shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The path twisted and turned, roots rising from the ground like grasping fingers. Elias stumbled, catching himself on a low branch, his heart racing. At last, they reached the oak. The graves at its base glowed faintly in the moonlight, the wild flowers pale and ghostly. The three figures stood among the roots, their faces hidden by veils of hair. Elias knelt, his voice trembling. "What do you want me to do?" The women raised their hands, pointing to the base of the tree. Elias saw for the first time a narrow gap between two thick roots, a dark opening just wide enough for a man to crawl through. The earth around it was soft, as if freshly turned. He hesitated, fear clawing at his throat. But the women's eyes met his, and he saw in them not anger, but hope, a desperate, pleading hope. He handed the lantern to Samuel. "Wait here. If I do not return by dawn, go to Abigail and tell her what happened." Samuel nodded, his face white with terror. Elias knelt and pressed his hands into the soft earth, widening the gap. The smell of damp soil and old decay rose around him. He took a deep breath and crawled into the darkness, the roots closing overhead like the jaws of some ancient beast. Inside, the air was cold and close. The tunnel sloped downward, the walls slick with moisture. Elias crawled on hands and knees, the darkness pressing in on all sides. He could hear the faint sound of water dripping, the distant rustle of something moving in the earth. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a small chamber. The roots of the oak formed a tangled ceiling, their tips glistening with sap. In the center of the chamber lay a bundle wrapped in rotting linen, bound with braided horsehair. Elias's hands shook as he reached for the bundle. He unwrapped it slowly, layer by layer, until at last he uncovered a small wooden box, carved with strange symbols. The box was old, the wood dark with age, the lid sealed with wax. He broke the seal and opened the box. Inside, nestled in a bed of dried leaves, were three objects: a lock of red hair, a silver locket, and a scrap of parchment covered in faded writing. Elias lifted the parchment, his eyes straining to read the words. The writing was cramped and hurried, the ink smeared by time and damp. He made out only fragments. "Forgive us. Not witches. We sought only peace. The bargain is made. The land will remember." He realized with a jolt that this was a confession, a final testament from the women themselves. They had not come to the oak to die, but to make a bargain, to bind themselves to the land in exchange for protection. The Watchers had found them, had twisted their ritual into a sacrifice, but the original bargain remained, buried and unfulfilled. Elias felt a surge of understanding. The curse was not just vengeance, it was a broken promise, a wound in the fabric of the land itself. The women's spirits and all the others trapped beneath the roots could not rest until the bargain was honored, until the truth was spoken, and the land was healed. He gathered the box and its contents, cradling them in his arms. He crawled back through the tunnel, the weight of centuries pressing down on him. When he emerged into the moonlight, Samuel was waiting, his eyes wide with relief. Elias showed him the box, the locket, the lock of hair, the parchment. "We must show these to the village," he said. "We must finish what was begun." The three figures watched from the shadows, their faces softening, their eyes shining with hope. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the world in gold and gray. Elias and Samuel hurried back to the village, the box clutched tight in Elias's hands. The final secret had been unearthed. Now, at last, the truth could be told. The sun was just rising as Elias and Samuel reached the edge of Danvers. The village was waking, smoke curling from chimneys, the first voices drifting through the morning air. Elias felt the box's weight in his arms, a burden, but also a key. He hurried to the parsonage, Samuel at his side, and knocked urgently at the door. Abigail answered, her eyes red-rimmed from another sleepless night. She took one look at Elias's face and stepped aside, ushering them in. Reverend Hale was already awake, seated at the table with his Bible open, as if he'd been waiting for them. Elias set the box on the table. "I found it beneath the oak. There's more, much more. The women, they made a bargain with the land. They sought protection, not vengeance. The Watchers twisted it, but the promise remains. We must honor it, or the curse will never end." He opened the box, showing them the lock of red hair, the locket, the parchment. Abigail reached for the locket, her hands trembling. She opened it and gasped. A tiny portrait inside, painted with exquisite care. The face was familiar, though Abigail could not say why. She pressed it to her heart, tears welling in her eyes. Reverend Hale read the parchment aloud, his voice hushed. The words were broken, but the meaning was clear. The women had come to the oak to bind themselves to the land, to offer their lives in exchange for peace and protection for the village. The Watchers had interrupted, turning the ritual into a murder, but the land had not forgotten the original intent. Abigail's voice was soft but certain. "We must finish the ritual. We must honor their bargain, not with blood but with truth and remembrance. Only then will the land be healed." Elias nodded. "We must gather the village, one last time. We must speak their names, tell their story, and return these tokens to the earth." Reverend Hale agreed, his face grave. "Let it be done before nightfall. The land is waiting." Word spread quickly. By midday, the villagers gathered at the edge of the woods, their faces drawn but resolute. The air was heavy with anticipation, the memory of the past weeks pressing down on them. Elias stood before them, the box in his hands, Abigail and Reverend Hale at his side. He spoke plainly, his voice carrying through the crowd. "We have learned the final truth of the three returned. They were not witches, nor were they vengeful spirits. They were women who sought to protect this village, to bind themselves to the land in a bargain of peace. Their sacrifice was twisted by fear, but the land remembers their intent. We must finish what they began." He held up the lock of hair, the locket, the parchment. "These are their tokens, their memories, their promises. We will return them to the earth, and we will speak their names not in fear but in gratitude." Abigail stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. She read the names aloud. Margaret Wilkins, Ruth Abbott, Silence Carter. "We remember you. We honor you. We are sorry." The villagers repeated the names, their voices rising in a chorus that echoed through the trees. Some wept openly, others stood in silent reverence. The air seemed to shimmer, the weight of centuries lifting, if only for a moment. Reverend Hale offered a prayer, not for forgiveness but for peace, for the women, for the village, for the land itself. When he finished, Elias knelt at the base of the oak and dug a small hole between the roots. He placed the lock of hair, the locket, and the parchment inside, covering them gently with earth. As he did, a breeze stirred the branches, and the sunlight broke through the clouds, bathing the oak in golden light. The villagers gasped as the air seemed to hum, a low, resonant sound that vibrated in their bones. For a moment the world held its breath. Then, slowly, the three figures appeared among the roots, their forms shimmering in the sunlight. Their faces were no longer hidden, their eyes bright with gratitude and relief. The stitches that had bound their mouths were gone. They smiled, and the air filled with the sound of their voices, soft, clear, and beautiful. "Thank you," they whispered, their words carrying on the wind. "Remember us. Remember all who were lost." The figures faded, their forms dissolving into the light. The oak stood tall and proud, its branches reaching skyward, its roots deep and strong. The graves at its base seemed to settle, the earth smoothing over as if the land itself was healing. The villagers stood in silence, awed and humbled. Some knelt and pressed their hands to the earth, whispering prayers of thanks. Others embraced, tears streaming down their faces. The curse, it seemed, had finally been broken. But as the crowd began to disperse, Elias lingered at the edge of the woods. He felt a presence beside him and turned to see Abigail, her eyes shining with hope and exhaustion. "Do you think it's truly over?" she asked. Elias looked at the oak, at the sunlight filtering through its leaves, at the peaceful graves. "I think the worst is over, but the land will always remember. It's up to us to keep telling the story, to honor the truth." Abigail nodded, her hand finding his. "We will. We must." As the last of the villagers left, Elias and Abigail stood together beneath the oak, the air around them filled with a sense of peace and possibility. The past had been unearthed, the dead remembered, the land healed, at least for now. But deep beneath the roots, in the heart of the earth, something ancient stirred. The story of the three returned was over, but the land of Danvers would never truly forget. And neither would those who had heard the voices in the darkness, who had seen the faces in the earth, who had felt the weight of history pressing down on their souls. The oak stood watch, silent and eternal, as the sun set over the village, and the shadows lengthened once more. Night fell gently over Danvers, the sky streaked with the last embers of sunset. The village was quieter than it had been in weeks, the air no longer thick with dread, but with a fragile, uncertain hope. Yet, as darkness deepened, Elias found himself unable to rest. He sat by the window of his small room, watching the oak silhouette against the moonlit sky, the memory of the day's ritual replaying in his mind. He thought of the women's voices, clear and grateful, and the way the land had seemed to breathe again. But he also remembered the vision beneath the roots, the countless faces, the mouths sewn shut, the sorrow that stretched back beyond the memory of any living soul. The three returned had found peace, but what of the others? What of the bargain, the ancient wound in the earth? A soft knock at his door startled him. Abigail entered, her face drawn but determined. She carried her ledger, its pages now filled with names and stories, confessions and memories. "I can't sleep," she admitted, sitting across from him. "I keep thinking of what you saw beneath the oak, all those faces, all those voices still trapped." Elias nodded, his own exhaustion etched deep. "I fear the land's pain runs deeper than we know. The three returned were only the beginning. There are others, so many others, who were never named, never mourned. The land remembers them too." Abigail opened her ledger, running her fingers over the ink. "We have the names of some, stories passed down, half-whispered, but so many are lost. How do we remember what was never written?" Elias was silent for a long moment. Perhaps it's not just about names. Perhaps it's about the act of remembering itself. The willingness to face the past, to speak the truth even when it hurts. They sat together in the quiet, the only sound the distant call of a night bird. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the oak, and for a moment, Elias thought he saw movement at its base, a flicker of white, a shadow slipping between the roots. He rose, heart pounding. "Come with me," he said. "I need to see it again. I need to know if the land is truly at peace." Abigail hesitated only a moment before following him into the night. The village was still, the houses dark, the only light the lantern Elias carried. They walked the familiar path to the oak, the grass cool and damp beneath their feet. As they approached, the air grew colder, the silence deeper. The graves at the base of the tree were undisturbed, the wildflowers now glowing faintly in the moonlight. But the sense of presence was unmistakable, an energy that hummed in the air, neither hostile nor welcoming, simply watchful. Elias knelt and pressed his hand to the earth. The ground was cool, but no longer pulsed with that desperate, aching sorrow. Instead, he felt a gentle warmth, as if the land itself was breathing easier. He closed his eyes, listening, but heard only the wind in the branches. Abigail knelt beside him, her hand finding his. "Do you feel it?" she whispered. He nodded. "It's quieter, but not silent. There's still something here." They sat in silence, letting the night settle around them. After a time, Abigail opened her ledger and began to read aloud the names she had gathered. Not just the three returned, but all the lost and forgotten, the vanished and unnamed. Her voice was soft but steady, each name a thread woven back into the fabric of the land. As she read, Elias felt the air shift, the oak's branches stirring as if in response. The wind carried the names through the trees, and for a moment he thought he heard voices answering, soft, distant, grateful. When Abigail finished, she closed the ledger and looked at Elias. "We must keep doing this. We must keep remembering. Not just for the three, but for all of them." Elias nodded, a sense of purpose settling over him. "We will. We'll gather the village, tell the stories, speak the names. We'll make sure the land never forgets." They rose and made their way back to the village, the first hints of dawn coloring the sky. As they walked, Elias felt the weight of the past lifting, replaced by a quiet determination. The work was not finished, but it had begun. In the days that followed, the village changed. The people of Danvers gathered each evening beneath the oak, sharing stories, reading names, lighting candles for the lost. The children played near the tree, no longer afraid, their laughter ringing through the woods. The land seemed to heal, the crops growing tall and strong, the well water sweet and clear. But not all was forgotten. Some nights, when the wind was high and the moon full, Elias would wake to the sound of voices outside his window, soft, insistent, calling him back to the oak. He would rise and walk the path alone, standing beneath the ancient branches, listening to the whispers of the past. He knew the land would always remember. The oak would always stand as a witness, a guardian, a reminder of what had been lost and found. And he knew too that the story of the three returned was only one chapter in a much older tale, a story of sorrow and hope, of darkness and light, of a village that had learned at last to face its own ghosts. As summer turned to autumn, and the leaves of the oak blazed red and gold, Elias and Abigail continued their work. They gathered stories, recorded names, and taught the children to honor the past. The curse was broken, but the memory remained, a living thread, binding the village to the land and the living to the dead. And so, beneath the watchful branches of the witch tree, the people of Danvers learned to remember, and the land at last began to heal. The seasons shifted, and with them the rhythm of life in Danvers. The fields yielded their harvest. The air grew crisp, and the first frost silvered the grass. The oak, once a symbol of dread, now stood at the heart of the village's new rituals. Each week, the people gathered beneath its branches, sharing bread and cider, telling stories by lantern light. The children wove garlands of wildflowers and draped them over the roots, their laughter echoing through the woods. Yet, for all the peace that had settled over the village, Elias could not shake the feeling that something remained unfinished. The land was quieter, yes, and the dead seemed at rest, but the memory of that vision beneath the roots haunted him. He saw it sometimes in dreams, the faces in the earth, the countless mouths sewn shut, the sorrow that ran deeper than any one story. One evening, as the first snow began to fall, Elias sat with Abigail in the parsonage, the fire crackling in the hearth. She was reading over her ledger, adding new names and stories as they came to her. He watched her, grateful for her strength, but troubled by a question he could not voice. At last, he spoke. "Abigail, do you ever wonder if there are things we're not meant to know? If some secrets are too old, too heavy, to ever be unearthed?" She looked up, her eyes thoughtful. "I do, but I also believe that silence is what cursed this place. Secrets fester in the dark. It's only by facing them that we can hope to heal." Elias nodded, but the unease remained. That night, he dreamed again of the oak. He saw the roots twisting through the earth, wrapping around bones and broken things. He heard the voices of the dead, not angry, but pleading, begging to be remembered, to be freed. He woke before dawn, the dream lingering like a shadow. He dressed and slipped out into the cold, the snow crunching beneath his boots. The village was silent, the world hushed and white. He walked to the oak, the lantern's light flickering in the darkness. As he approached, he saw something strange, a patch of earth at the base of the tree where the snow had not settled. The ground was bare, the soil dark and damp. Elias knelt, brushing aside the leaves, and found a small stone, smooth and round, carved with a symbol he did not recognize. He turned it over in his hand, feeling a faint warmth radiate from its surface. The symbol was simple, a circle, crossed by 3 lines, forming a triangle at its center. It was the same shape the women's bodies had formed beneath the oak. Elias felt a shiver run through him. He slipped the stone into his pocket and returned to the parsonage, his mind racing. He showed it to Abigail, who traced the symbol with her finger. "It's a mark of binding," she said softly. "A sign of a pact or a promise. I've seen it in old books, in the margins of my mother's Bible. It's older than the village, older than the trials." They pored over Abigail's books and ledgers, searching for any mention of the symbol. At last, in a crumbling volume of local folklore, they found a passage that chilled them both. In the deep woods, where the old oak stands, the land remembers, a bargain struck in blood and sorrow, sealed by the mark of 3. So long as the pact is honored, the land will protect. But should the promise be broken, the roots will hunger, and the dead will not rest. Elias read the words aloud, his voice barely more than a whisper. The roots will hunger. Abigail's face was pale. We honored the women. But what of the bargain? What if there is more to be done? They decided to seek out Mary Bradbury, the oldest woman in Danvers, whose memory stretched back further than anyone's. They found her by the fire in her cottage, her eyes sharp despite her years. Elias showed her the stone, and she nodded slowly. My grandmother spoke of the mark. She said it was a promise made to the land itself. The women who vanished, they were not the first. There were others long before the trials. The land demanded a price, and the people paid it, year after year. Abigail's voice trembled. A price? What kind of price? Mary's gaze was steady. A life sometimes, a secret, always. The land is old, older than our names, older than our faith. It remembers every promise, every betrayal. The oak is its heart. If the bargain is not kept, the land will take what it is owed. Elias felt the weight of her words settle over him. What must we do? Mary shook her head. I do not know, but the mark has appeared for a reason. The land is speaking to you. Listen, and you may find the answer. They left Mary's cottage in silence, the snow falling thick and fast. Elias felt the stone heavy in his pocket, the symbol burning in his mind. He knew the peace in Danvers was fragile, a thin crust over something ancient and hungry. That night, as the wind howled through the trees, Elias sat by the fire, the stone in his hand. He stared into the flames, searching for meaning, for guidance. He knew the story was not yet finished. The land had more to say, and he would have to listen, no matter what it cost. Outside, the oak stood silent in the snow, its roots deep in the earth, its branches reaching for the sky. The bargain was not yet fulfilled. The past was not yet done with Danvers. And the witch tree waited, patient and eternal, for the next chapter to begin. The wind rattled the windows of the parsonage all night, carrying with it the distant, mournful cry of a lone crow. Elias sat awake, the stone warm in his palm, the symbol burned into his thoughts. He felt as if he stood on the edge of something vast and unknowable, a chasm of memory and promise, stretching back before the first settler's axe ever touched the woods. By morning, the snow had stopped, leaving the world muffled and white. Abigail found Elias at the table, the stone before him, his eyes red from lack of sleep. She poured him a cup of tea and sat beside him, her presence a comfort in the hush of dawn. We must go back to the oak, Elias said quietly. The land is calling. I feel it in my bones. Abigail nodded, her resolve as steady as his. We'll go together. Whatever the bargain is, we'll face it side by side. They bundled themselves against the cold and set out, the village still sleeping behind shuttered windows. The snow crunched beneath their boots, the only sound in the silent morning. As they neared the oak, the air seemed to thicken, the world narrowing to the ancient tree and the patch of bare earth at its base. Elias knelt and pressed the stone into the ground, the symbol facing upward. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the earth shivered, and a low hum rose from the roots, vibrating through the soles of their feet. The snow melted in a perfect circle around the stone, exposing dark living soil. Abigail knelt beside him, her breath clouding in the cold air. What do you want from us? She whispered, her words meant for the land, the tree, the spirits that lingered. The hum deepened, and Elias felt a presence, vast, ancient, neither kind nor cruel, simply aware. Images flickered in his mind. The first people to walk these woods, their feet bare on the moss. The settlers, fearful and desperate, carving a home from the wilderness. The women standing beneath the oak, their hands joined in hope and sorrow. He saw the bargain struck, not in malice but in necessity, a promise to honor the land, to remember its power, to keep its stories alive. He saw the promise broken, again and again, by fear, by silence, by the refusal to remember. A voice, not quite human, not quite earth, filled his mind. Remember us, honor the bargain, speak the truth and the land will rest. Elias gasped, the vision fading. He looked at Abigail, who nodded, tears in her eyes. We must gather the village. We must tell them everything. The bargain, the mark, the price of forgetting. They hurried back to Danvers, the urgency of their task burning in their veins. By midday, the church bell rang out, calling the villagers to the meeting house. The people came, their faces anxious, sensing the gravity of what was to come. Elias stood before them, the stone in his hand, Abigail at his side. He spoke of the mark, the ancient bargain, the promise made and broken. He told them of the visions, the voices, the land's hunger for remembrance. Abigail read from her ledger, her voice steady. The land does not ask for blood. It asks for truth, for memory, for the stories of those who came before and those who were lost. We must speak their names, tell their tales, and honor the promise our ancestors made. A hush fell over the crowd. Then, slowly, the villagers began to speak. They shared stories passed down through generations, of the first people, of the old ways, of the bargains struck in the dark. They spoke of the land's gifts and its dangers, of the price paid for forgetting. Reverend Hale, his voice trembling, confessed the church's role in silencing the old stories, in turning fear into violence. We must do better, he said, his eyes shining with tears. We must remember, and we must teach our children to remember. The meeting lasted until dusk, the air thick with grief and hope. When it was over, Elias led the villagers to the oak. They formed a circle around the tree, each person holding a candle, their faces lit by the soft golden glow. Elias placed the stone at the base of the oak, the symbol facing outward. He spoke the words that had come to him in the vision. We remember, we honor the bargain, we speak the truth, and we ask the land to rest. One by one, the villagers stepped forward, each placing a token at the base of the tree. A scrap of cloth, a lock of hair, a stone from the fields, a page from a family Bible. Each token was a memory, a story, a promise to remember. As the last candle was placed, the wind rose, swirling around the oak. The branches shivered and the earth seemed to sigh. The air filled with the scent of wildflowers and fresh-turned soil, and for a moment, the villagers felt the presence of those who had come before, watching, listening, at peace. The candles flickered, then burned brighter, their flames steady in the night. The villagers stood in silence, the weight of centuries lifting, the land's hunger finally sated. Elias felt the presence recede, gentle and grateful. The bargain had been honored. The land would rest. As the villagers drifted back to their homes, Elias and Abigail remained beneath the oak, their hands entwined. The tree stood tall and silent, its roots deep in the earth, its branches reaching for the stars. The story of the three returned had ended, but the story of Danvers, of the land and its people, would go on, remembered, honored, and never again forgotten. The days that followed were the quietest Danvers had known in living memory. The air felt lighter, the sky clearer, as if the land itself had exhaled after centuries of holding its breath. The villagers went about their work with a new sense of purpose, their faces open and unburdened. Children played beneath the oak, their laughter ringing through the woods, and the old ones sat in the sun, telling stories that had long been kept in the shadows. Elias and Abigail continued their work, gathering stories, recording names, and teaching the children to honor the past. The tokens left at the base of the oak remained undisturbed, a growing shrine to memory and promise. Each week, the village gathered to add new offerings to speak the names of the lost and to remind themselves of the bargain that bound them to the land. But even as peace settled over Danvers, Elias could not shake the feeling that something lingered at the edge of his awareness. A faint whisper, a shadow in the corner of his eye. He dreamed often of the oak, of roots twisting through the earth, of faces watching from the darkness. The dreams were no longer filled with terror, but with a deep, aching sorrow, a sense that the land's wounds, though healing, would never fully close. One evening, as the first green shoots of spring pushed through the thawing earth, Elias sat beneath the oak, his journal open in his lap. Abigail joined him, her skirts brushing the wildflowers that now grew thick around the tree's roots. "Do you feel it?" she asked softly, her gaze on the horizon where the sun was setting in a blaze of gold and crimson. Elias nodded. "The land is quieter, but it's not silent. There's still something waiting, something we haven't seen." Abigail traced the mark on the stone, now half buried in moss. "Maybe it's not for us to see. Maybe it's enough that we remember, that we keep the promise." Elias closed his journal, the pages filled with stories and names, confessions and hopes. "I wonder if the land will ever truly forgive us, or if it simply learns to live with its scars." Abigail smiled, her hand finding his. "Scars are a kind of memory too. They remind us of what we've survived." As dusk deepened, the villagers gathered for their weekly ritual. They brought new tokens, ribbons, feathers, bits of pottery, and scraps of old letters. They spoke the names of the three returned, and of others who had been lost to time and silence. The air was filled with the scent of wildflowers and wood smoke, the sound of voices raised in remembrance. Reverend Hale, now older and slower, led the prayers. His voice was softer but steadier, shaped by humility and hard-won wisdom. "We are bound to this land, as it is bound to us. Let us never forget the price of silence nor the power of truth." As the candles flickered in the dusk, Elias felt the presence of the past, gentle, watchful, no longer hungry. The oak's branches swayed in the evening breeze, and for a moment, he thought he saw the three returned standing among the roots, their faces peaceful, their eyes bright with gratitude. After the gathering, Elias lingered beneath the tree, the night air cool on his skin. He closed his eyes and listened, letting the sounds of the village wash over him. He heard laughter, the low murmur of voices, the distant call of a night bird, and beneath it all he heard the steady heartbeat of the land. Slow, deep, eternal. He thought of the stories he had collected, the names he had written, the promises he had made. He wondered what future generations would remember, what stories they would tell, what bargains they would strike with the land. Abigail joined him, her arm slipping through his. "Come home," she whispered. "The land will keep its watch. We've done what we can." They walked back to the village together, the path lit by the soft glow of lanterns. The houses were warm and welcoming, the windows bright with candlelight. The people of Danvers had learned to live with their ghosts, to honor the past without being haunted by it. But as Elias drifted into sleep that night, a final dream came to him, clearer and more vivid than any before. He stood beneath the oak, the roots twisting around his feet, the branches arching overhead. The three returned, stood before him, their faces serene, their eyes filled with a strange, knowing light. One of them, Margaret, with the crescent birthmark, stepped forward and placed her hand on his chest. Her touch was cool, but not cold. She spoke, her voice echoing in his mind. "You have done well, Elias Ward. You have remembered, and you have taught others to remember. But the land is old, and its hunger is never truly sated. There will come a time when the bargain is tested again. When that day comes, remember what you have learned. Speak the truth. Honor the promise, and the land will endure." Elias woke with a start, the words ringing in his ears. He lay in the darkness, listening to the wind in the trees, the steady breathing of Abigail beside him. He knew the peace they had won was precious, but fragile, a gift to be guarded, a lesson to be passed down. The oak stood watch over Danvers, its roots deep in the earth, its branches reaching for the sky. The story of the three returned had become legend, a warning and a blessing, a reminder of the power of memory and the price of forgetting. And in the heart of the land, something ancient and watchful waited, patient as the turning of the seasons, ready to test the bargain once more. The years slipped by, and the story of the three returned became woven into the fabric of Danvers. Children grew up hearing the tale beneath the oak, their imaginations fired by the mystery and the warning. The tokens at the tree's base multiplied, a living archive of memory and gratitude. Each spring, the wildflowers bloomed brighter, and the land seemed to hum with quiet contentment. Elias and Abigail grew older, their hair silvering, their faces lined with the gentle marks of time. They remained the keepers of the story, the ones to whom villagers brought new names, new confessions, new fragments of the past. Their home was filled with ledgers and journals, scraps of parchment, and the odd, comforting clutter of a life spent in service to memory. Yet, as the decades passed, the world beyond Danvers changed. New roads were cut through the woods, and strangers arrived, drawn by the promise of fertile land and fresh beginnings. Some scoffed at the old stories, dismissing them as superstition. Others, sensing the weight of history in the air, grew uneasy and kept their distance from the oak. Elias watched these changes with a mixture of hope and dread. He knew that memory was fragile, that stories could be lost as easily as they were told. He worried that the bargain, so carefully honored, might be forgotten by those who did not understand its cost. One autumn, as the leaves turned and the air grew sharp, a group of men from Boston arrived in Danvers. They were merchants and land surveyors, their eyes bright with ambition. They spoke of progress, of clearing more land, of building a new road that would pass directly through the old woods, through the very place where the oak stood. The village gathered in the meeting house, the air thick with anxiety. Elias, now stooped and gray, stood before the crowd, his voice thin but resolute. "The oak is not just a tree," he said. "It is the heart of this land, the keeper of our promise. If we break the bargain, if we forget what was done here, the land will remember. The price will be paid, one way or another." Some of the newcomers laughed, but others shifted uneasily, glancing at the villagers who nodded in solemn agreement. Abigail, her voice still clear and strong, read from her ledger, recounting the story of the three returned, the watchers, and the ancient mark of binding. The debate raged late into the night. Some argued for progress, for the future. Others pleaded for caution, for respect. In the end, it was the oldest among them, Mary Bradbury, now nearly blind, who spoke the final word. "I have seen what happens when the land is angered," she said, her voice trembling. "I have seen the dead walk and the living suffer. Leave the oak be. Honor the promise, or you will bring sorrow on us all." The vote was close, but the village chose to preserve the oak, to reroute the road, to keep the heart of the woods untouched. The newcomers grumbled, but the decision stood. The land, for now, was safe. That winter, Elias fell ill. He spent his last days in the parsonage, surrounded by the ledgers and journals he and Abigail had filled over the years. The villagers came to pay their respects, to thank him for his wisdom, to promise they would remember. On his final night, as the snow fell softly outside, Elias dreamed once more of the oak. He saw the three returned, their faces radiant, their eyes filled with peace. Margaret spoke, her voice gentle. "You have kept the promise, Elias. You have given us rest. But remember, every generation must choose. The land will always test the living. Tell them to listen. Tell them to remember." Elias smiled in his sleep, and when morning came, he was gone, his hand resting on the old stone, the mark of binding faintly glowing in the dawn light. Abigail mourned him, but she did not falter. She became the village's memory, the keeper of the ledgers, the voice that reminded each new child of the story's weight. She taught them to honor the oak, to leave tokens at its roots, to speak the names of the lost. Years passed, and Abigail too grew frail. On her last evening, she walked to the oak, leaning on the arm of a young girl who would one day take her place. She placed her hand on the bark, feeling the pulse of the land beneath her palm. "Remember," she whispered. "Promise me you'll remember." The girl nodded, her eyes wide with wonder and fear. "I promise." Abigail smiled, her heart at peace. She knew the story would live on, as long as there were those willing to listen, to speak, to honor the past. As the sun set, the oak stood tall and silent, its branches etched against the sky. The land was quiet but not empty. The memory of the three returned lingered in the air, woven into the roots, the soil, the very stones of Danvers. And somewhere, deep beneath the earth, the old bargain slept, waiting as it always had for the next time it would be called upon, for the next voice to speak the truth, for the next heart to remember. Generations passed and the world outside Danvers changed beyond recognition. The old village became a town, then a small city, its streets paved and its fields divided by fences and roads. The woods shrank, but the oak remained, a stubborn sentinel at the edge of progress. Children still played beneath its branches, though fewer each year knew the true story of the three returned. The ledgers and journals, once read by candlelight, gathered dust on library shelves, their pages yellowing with age. Yet every so often, when a storm rolled in from the sea and the wind howled through the trees, the old fear would return. Locals whispered that the oak wept blood during the fiercest rains, that the ground beneath it grew soft and red, and that the crows gathered in its branches, watching with bright, knowing eyes. Some said they saw three women in the mist, their faces pale and sad, their hair streaming like banners in the wind. Most dismissed these tales as superstition, relics of a darker time. But a few remembered. A few still left tokens at the base of the tree. Coins, ribbons, scraps of paper with names written in trembling hands. The promise endured, fragile but unbroken, passed from one generation to the next. In the spring of 1912, a young woman named Clara Putnam returned to Danvers after years away. She was a teacher, curious and sharp, with a mind for history and a heart for stories. She had heard the legend of the three returned from her grandmother, who had heard it from Abigail herself. Clara was drawn to the oak, to the mystery that clung to it like morning fog. One rainy afternoon, Clara visited the old tree. The ground was muddy, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and wildflowers. She knelt at the base of the oak, brushing aside the leaves and moss. Her fingers found something hard, a smooth stone, carved with a faded symbol, a circle crossed by three lines, forming a triangle at its center. Clara traced the mark, feeling a shiver run through her. She remembered her grandmother's words. "The land remembers, the bargain endures. Speak the truth, and the land will rest." That night, Clara pored over the old ledgers in the town library, reading by the flickering light of a single lamp. She found the story of the three returned, the watchers, the ancient bargain. She read the names, the confessions, the promises made and kept and broken. She felt the weight of history settle over her, heavy and inescapable. The next day, Clara gathered a group of children beneath the oak. She told them the story, not just the legend, but the truth. She spoke of fear and silence, of memory and forgiveness, of the power of speaking names aloud. She taught them to honor the past, to leave tokens at the tree, to remember the bargain that bound them to the land. As she spoke, the wind rose, rustling the branches overhead. The children listened, wide-eyed and solemn, their voices joining hers as they repeated the names: Margaret Wilkins, Ruth Abbott, Silence Carter. The three returned. That night, a storm swept through Danvers. Lightning split the sky and rain lashed the earth. The townspeople huddled in their homes, listening to the wind howl and the crows cry. In the morning, they found the oak standing tall, its roots washed clean, the ground beneath it soft but unbroken. The tokens left by Clara and the children were gone, as if the land itself had accepted their offering. But something else had changed. The old fear did not return. The air felt lighter, the earth steadier. The crows no longer gathered in the branches, and the tree no longer wept blood. The story of the three returned was told again and again, not as a warning but as a lesson, a reminder of the power of memory, the danger of silence, and the strength of a promise kept. Years turned to decades and the world moved on. The oak grew older, its branches gnarled and thick, its roots deep and strong. The town of Danvers changed, but the tree remained, a living witness to all that had passed. And yet, on certain nights, when the wind was just right and the moon hung low, a few still claimed to see three women standing beneath the oak, their faces calm, their eyes bright with something that was not quite sorrow, not quite joy. They said the women watched over the town, guardians of the old bargain, keepers of the land's memory. One autumn, a group of workers came to clear the woods for a new road. They brought axes and saws, laughing at the old stories. But when they reached the oak, their tools broke, their hands blistered, and the ground turned to mud beneath their feet. They left the tree standing, shaken and silent, unwilling to tempt whatever power lingered there. The legend of the three returned became part of Danvers itself, a story told in whispers and in song, a thread woven through the lives of all who called the place home. The oak stood as a reminder that the past is never truly buried, that the land remembers, and that some promises must be kept, no matter the cost. And so, the witch tree waits, its roots tangled with secrets, its branches heavy with memory. The bargain endures, as it always has, as it always will. For in Danvers, the dead do not rest easy, and the land never truly forgets. If you ever find yourself in those woods, and the wind begins to howl, listen closely. You may hear the voices of the three returned, whispering their story to the roots and the rain. Remember them, speak their names, for the land is listening, and the bargain is never truly done. And that is the story of the witch tree hangings, the curse, the promise, and the haunting truth that still lingers, waiting for the next soul brave enough to remember. And so, the story of the witch tree hangings drifts back into the mist. Three women, a cursed oak, and a bargain that still binds the roots of Danvers. But legends like these are never truly finished. They wait in the dark, in the hush before a storm, in the silence beneath ancient trees for someone willing to listen and to remember. If you felt a chill tonight, or if you've ever walked beneath old branches and wondered what stories the land is keeping, I invite you to share your thoughts below. Have you heard whispers in the woods or stumbled across a secret your town refuses to speak of? Your stories are the lifeblood of this channel, and together, we keep the past from slipping away. If you're drawn to tales where history and haunting intertwine, where every shadow might hold a secret, subscribe to Sanctified Secrets and ring the bell so you never miss what waits in the dark. Here, we honor the forgotten, we speak the names, and we remember, because some stories are too powerful to stay silent. Thank you for joining me beneath the witch tree. Until next time, keep your lantern lit, your mind open, and your heart brave. The land is listening, and so are we. Good night, and may your dreams be free of roots.